Brian, they talked about how they bridge our aspect and they get on that. I was you knew to be there.
It was good. It was very good. They just talked about.
No, I'm saying Darren.
Designing without a designer. If you don't have a designer,
what?
If you don't have a designer doing your stuff right off the bat, you know, designing yourself, just some. It was good. This slide is blank.
That's a lot.
Hopefully the text is always that large. I'll be able to read it the whole time.
I'm a big fan of big font size.
That's just so that when I can't read the screen, I'm going to look at this. Just look right here and see. It's like the Jumbotron, only it's the Minitron. It's the opposite of the Jumbotron.
Minitron, wasn't that a cartoon in the 80s?
Minitron? Voltron.
Yeah.
What was the bad guy's name in Battle of the Planets? Was that Voltron?
Brian's not here. What is this Battle of the Planets? Come on, Brian, we're not as lazy.
What?
Yeah, I have no idea.
G-Force?
No idea.
You guys are youngins. I'll look it up for you. So which one did DJ go to? Did he go to the GIP one? Is that the, what was that? Version of Python's get of the year.
I think GIP.
Was that? What's GIP, right?
Yeah, oh yeah, that's a British term for like an idiot.
Really do not want you to connect. This is what we use. Doesn't matter.
I didn't actually expect to be ready early.
Contrast, placement,
Color, but not too much. Column alignment.
Alright, well I'll go ahead and start with just an introduction real quick. Just a quick note, remember our sponsors, Bluehost, X-Mission, and of course UVU. We want to thank UVU for being here and for obviously giving us the place to host our open source this year. So, yeah, thanks to them. And also check out our booths for X-Mission and Bluehost. X-Mission is the biggest ISP in the state right now. They can build a network if you need anything, and they also do a lot of residential and commercial networking as well. And then for Bluehost, if you guys have any site needs, or we're also hiring a few developer, admin, and some tech support positions. So, yeah, hit us up. We'll be out in the hall and turn the time over to you for the rest of the cut.
I think technically we have a minute, but first of all, my apologies if I have to down a lot of water and survive on cough drops. I had a cold last week and my throat has been really torn up. I'm Joseph Scott. I think I know some of you, but for those of you who don't know me or how to get a hold of me, there's various information. As you can probably guess what my IRC nick is too, I'm pretty consistent. What we're going to talk about for the next hour is improving front-end performance. So before I get into this, I personally enjoy more of a back and forth sort of style. So if you have a question, if we're talking about something specific and it's not clear, throw your hand up, throw a piece of paper, whatever it takes to get my attention.
Wait, really?
So that we can address this. Nobody's taken me up on throwing the paper yet, but I usually offer.
Just wait.
So, because I'm a firm believer in if there's something that isn't clear, let's just resolve that right there. And if there's other questions that maybe you want to dive deeper, we can save those to the end. But let's knock out the ones where if something's not clear, or if it turns out I'm doing something wrong. But we're going to talk about improving front-end performance. And really what this boils down to me is, for the user, what is that experience? How do they perceive your site loading? Is this slow? Is this fast? Now, that's a bit subjective sometimes. And in computers, we're not really good about being subjective. What we want is concrete measurements. We want to know, was X faster than Y? Was Z faster than both of them? So we're really fortunate right now. There's a lot of tools out there to help us evaluate whether or not one version of a site is faster than another version of the site, and so forth. One of these is the Chrome Network Panel. If you use Chrome, the Chrome Developer Tools, you've probably seen this. It's really nifty. Waterfall chart of what happens. This one is desertnews.com. And you can see they load like a gazillion things. I couldn't even fit it on the screen. Another item in Chrome is called PageSpeed. It's a plugin by the folks at Google. There's also a version for Firefox. What it does is it will go and reload the page and then do an analysis of whether or not you're following various so-called best practices and various techniques for improving page performance. So this is a really simple way, this plugin is a really simple way to get a snapshot of whether or not there are some obvious things that you could do to improve. And it also has tons of links in there for various documentation. So it'll tell you combine images into CSS sprites, and then it'll have a link that'll give you all sorts of information on how to do those techniques. So it's really helpful. Another favorite of mine is called webpagetest.org. It'll generate a ton of things. Another one of the things is another waterfall chart. And I think this is Desert News again, just because I don't see Justin in the room, so Justin's going to work for them, Justin Carmody. So I can talk about this and give him grief later. But they generate a ton of information as well. And there's a lot of others that do this sort of thing. Zoom and some other page speed analysis services. One of the reasons I really like webpagetest.org is it's all open source, and you can actually go and run an instance of it yourself in your own data center, your own server, whatever. Which is really handy. If you want to try and eliminate the variance between running this test from some server in New York or San Francisco or Amsterdam or whatever, you can run this in a more controlled environment, try and get more consistent results.
When we roll out a new front-end site, we could have really used this thing a little while ago for ourselves. We just recently changed our front-end, run this test in our own test environment before we release it to the public.
Exactly. And so I recommend kind of a combination of things. I mean, I enjoy using their public provided servers to do this sorts of tests. But if you really want to try to eliminate variance, you can run this in your own network and get controlled results. Yeah, so that's a perfect example of rolling out new versions and going, okay, is this actually making things better or not? And it supports a variety of browsers. You can run it against IE, Chrome, Firefox, and different versions of IE. So it's a pretty good service. And it's free, which I also enjoy. So let's get into some of the nitty-gritty here. The techniques, common things that come up for improving website performance. And the first one, I'm going to start like the basic level stuff, HTTP compression. The idea here is if you've ever used like zip or something like that, browsers and servers can do the same thing. They can say, instead of giving you the raw content, I'm going to compress it first, give you the compressed version, and then the browser can uncompress it. So what's this look like? When you make a request, the browser is going to say, I accept the following types of encoding, and these are both compression techniques, gzip being the most common. And the server is going to come back and say, you said I can compress this. So here's a compressed version, and I'm telling you that it's compressed by telling you that the content encoding type is gzip. And that's how the browser knows, I got a compressed result back. Because even if the browser asks for it, it's still up to the server to actually do it. Historically, this has had some problems. It's not really too much of an issue now, but way back in the day, like IE 5 or something like that, IE would lie. It would tell the server, oh, hey, can you please compress this? It would say accept encoding gzip. And the server would go, oh, you asked for a compressed version. Here's a compressed version. And IE would go, I don't know what to do with this. So basically lie. So if you look in like the default Apache config, you'll still probably see for the compression settings, it'll say, if we got a compression request and it's not one of the following versions of IE, then we're allowed to give it a compressed result. Today those versions are so old and it's probably not as big a deal, but it's had some historical issues and hiccups. What this looks like in a broader scope of response is that content encoding right there. You get a whole bunch of information and it's that one specific thing. Another aspect of this, and it's not directly related to compression itself, but it comes up in that context a lot, is a header called vary. And what happens is, let's say you've got your client, you've got your server, and you have a proxy sitting in the middle for some reason. The proxy is also going to cache some of this information. Now, by default, it's going to go, you're requesting example.com/style.css. And that's the unique reference for that item that I'm going to cache. The problem is, there's actually other variables that the proxy server needs to use to determine whether or not it can serve a cached version. So going back to this, what it needs to do is cache potentially both a compressed and non-compressed version of a given resource. And that's what this vary header does, is it says, take the URL, which you're already doing, and these other HTTP headers to determine whether or not a request matches. So this is really critical because I've actually found some very large sites that aren't doing this correctly. And they will return a compressed result because they have a reverse proxy in the middle. They'll return a compressed result even if you don't ask for it. Which fortunately, most clients are smart enough to figure that out. But technically that's not the right thing to do. So if you're going to turn on compression, which I recommend, you need to look at things like the vary header and go, am I telling proxies the right thing to do about how to cache this result? The next basic thing is called HTTP keep alive. The idea here is that there's a whole bunch of steps that have to happen before a browser actually gets to make a request to a server. And that whole TCP layer, it's got to go through and take care of that before it gets to start communicating to the server. Now, there's really not much point in having to redo that connection if it's got to talk to the same server over and over again. It's much more efficient to just keep that connection and make additional requests and get responses back. So keep alive is what controls that. And keep alive is not very exciting. The request says connection keep alive, and the response is connection keep alive. Now, things get a little bit confusing in this historically too, because the spec for HTTP 1.0 actually included this feature, but it was kind of ambiguous. It wasn't really clear how that should operate. So technically, the right way is that when you make a response, the browser should say connection keep alive, telling both ends, all right, we need to keep this connection alive, and the server should be responding connection keep alive. And it got a little bit confusing because it wasn't real clear what was going on. So in HTTP 1.1, they basically said all connections are keep alive by default unless it doesn't work, unless it fails for some reason. So you can actually get, if you look at request and response, you can get some interesting results where browsers will make a request and not include keep alive, and then the server will come back and include keep alive, just because by default that's what it's doing. Now there's a lot of combinations about how this sort of thing can work. For a standard sort of web server, you're probably making a lot of requests from the same client to the same server. And you really want to have that keep alive happen. So you're probably going to have a timeout on that on the server that's relatively high. If you're doing something like if you're like the company I work for runs gravatar.com, which hosts a gazillion images. That's all it does, is serve lots and lots of images. We actually tune the keep alive relatively low because we have to balance out having multiple requests with having lots of requests from other places. So we've kind of got to balance out that process. So in a lot of these things, there's various details that we can't always say just do this like 100% of the time, and it's always the right thing to do. Sometimes you have to look at your own situation and tweak things a bit. But keep alive is one of those things that in general is a good thing, and if you can tune the timeout for it a little bit higher, then oftentimes you'll get better results. Now I've mentioned a little bit, let's get into caching because there's a lot of things that control how caching works. First up is the response that you get back from the server. We're going to look at some of the details here. One of the headers is called expires, and it's very simple. It says, hey, this is how long this resource is good for. So the browser is allowed to keep that technically up until that time, and when it hits that, it's going to say, this looks like it's probably expired, so I need to go back and request it again. Now, there are other aspects to this because people discovered that wasn't necessarily fine-grained enough. So they came up with a cache control header, and one of the things it does is provide a max age in seconds. So if you divide that by 86,400, you should get 365. So that's cache control for 1 year. Now, the nice part about this is it's relative to the request. So instead of saying, here's a hard and fast date on which this would expire like that, this is relative to the request. So 1 year from this request, any additional lookups for this, we should get a cache hit. We shouldn't have to request it again, which is a big win. There's other layers, though, that get more involved. We may not be sure if this is entirely cacheable, so we'll get a response back that says last modified on such and such date, and the browser will go, okay, I'm going to make a request that includes this header called if modified since, and provide a date. Now what that allows the server to do is go, okay, you've said you've got this resource, and you're asking for it again, but the way that you're going kind of plain English this, the way to describe it would be, give me this resource again if it's newer than this date. And so if it's not newer than this date, I'm just going to use the cached version. And the way the server comes back is, say, 304 not modified, you can use the cached version. There's other fun headers. One's called etag. This value for etag isn't anything special per se. It's just an opaque token that says this represents a reference for this resource. It could be a checksum, it could be any number of things. And you'll actually, this is kind of the standard-ish sort of format, but it doesn't have to have dashes, it doesn't have to be hex. I mean, it could be any number of things. And some sites do really weird things with etext. But again, the way the browser is enabled to do this is it makes the request and says, if none match. And again, this allows the server to go, if this token is the same for a given resource, then it's cached. You can use the cached version. I don't have to resend you this whole thing. Excuse me. And what you want to see in these types of things is 304 not modified. HTTP response of 200 OK means I got your request, and here is the whole resource for whatever you asked for. You know, your 100K JAVASCRIPT file or whatever. When we're talking about caching, what we want to see is this 304 not modified, because all you get back are the headers, and then you're allowed to use the cached version. This is a major win because, you know, if it is that 100K JavaScript file, now you don't have to download it. So that makes it much more efficient. A little bit of a rant here on e-tags. If you have read things like Steve Souther's books on even faster websites and high-performance websites, if you've read the Yahoo rules on web performance and stuff like that, a lot of people get really hung up on this idea of e-tags because in some cases they're broken. And so you'll see a lot of people say, well, you just should be disabling e-tags. The history behind this is, and I should have looked this up to see if it's still true, Apache, by default, the way it calculates an e-tag is it will include the inode for the file as a reference in the e-tag value, which in and of itself is fine. It also uses mtime and some other stuff, but it's the inode that is the real issue. Now, if you have one web server, that's fine. That inode is unlikely to change if the file doesn't change. If you have 3 web servers with identical configuration, an identical layout, and identical Apache config, the inode values are likely to be different. So what happens is people will build a back-end server farm with multiple Apache servers, and what will happen is you hit server 1 and you get an e-tag value, a given e-tag value. You hit server 2 and you get a different e-tag value, and you hit server 3 and you get a third e-tag value, which completely defeats the whole purpose of having this e-tag in the first place. So, that's just the way Apache comes configured out of the box. So there was this history of people going, oh, you should disable e-tags because Apache basically broke it. Well, they broke it by default, but it doesn't have to stay broken. So don't get hung up on that.
You largely get to dodge that problem if your load balancer is sticking a particular session to one web server or the other.
The question was, can you dodge that if your load balancer is sticking? Yes, basically. Because the inode is not going to change, and it's always in that same. You know, the real answer is just to fix the Apache config. Because if that server goes down, and your load balancer starts redirecting that traffic to another backend, then it's going to have to go through this whole process of basically repriming the cache for all these requests.
And that is in the standard Apache config.
Yeah. And it's not hard to change. It's just one of those things that most people just install the Apache package that comes with their distro, and it works out of the box, so they don't worry about it, which is fair enough. But it causes this problem where, you know, people don't see the results that they expected. Now, hopefully, if you've gone through this, you're thinking, okay, well, I've got this cached resource that I told web servers they can cache for up to a year or longer, right? I mean, I go for broke and make it 10 years. How do I update that, right? For example, let's say we're talking about a CSS file, and you update the design for your site. And now you need to have some way to get clients to get the updated version. There's two standard techniques for this. Excuse me. The first one is just to use a variable at the end of your resource. This works because if you bump that V value, browsers look at that as a separate resource because of the way HTTP GET is defined. It looks at it as a separate resource. This is really handy to use. It's the way that I generally do it. It's not without a drawback. There are older versions of proxies like Squid who don't follow that. They won't properly update when you bump that. My personal experience is that that's a minority enough that I don't worry about it. But if you really want to be like 100% spot on, you can include basically that same sort of value in the file name itself and just have your web server rewrite that request so that it could look at things and go, okay, anything that's style dot with a number dot CSS, I'm going to rewrite it to pull the correct CSS value or CSS file. So that would be like the canonical 100% sort of way. But it's a little bit harder. You've got to do some additional rules. So I generally just...
So do you prefer that over using the if modified since headers?
It's still going to send those caching headers in a response and request. But this is going to be a different... For all intents and purposes, this is a different resource to the browser.
Right.
So when I bump that from 1 to 2, it considers it a completely different file. So it's not going to send that same data. So when I bump it to 2...
So the idea is that you, in most cases, are avoiding the request and then the not modified coming back.
Right. Because the client doesn't consider this a cached version, so it's not going to send an if modified sense.
So this is for cache busting?
Mm-hmm. Exactly. One of the things that work, actually, we have a function called cache bust.
So,
yeah,
I'm a noob, but I have to ask, why is the second one more work than the first? I don't see why it would be different.
It's more work for configuring the server. Because in this case, you actually probably only have that one file. Okay? In this one, you either have to configure your server to do rewrite rules correctly, so that it basically strips the one out, so that it makes a request. Or, the other option is you actually have to have multiple copies of that file, style.1, style.2, style.blah, laying around in order to make sure the requests all succeed correctly.
Okay, I get it.
So, I mean, when you see this sort of technique of busting cache, this is one that comes up. It's just that I don't think that many people use it. But it's kind of like if you wanted to be 100% correct versus 99.99 correct, that'd be a way to do it. Now, man, I wish Justin was in here. Avoid redirects is another issue that comes up. I see a lot of sites where they, you make a request for the site, and it sends you a location header back saying, I know what you're looking for, but it actually exists over here. And so the browser takes that and then makes another request. So I picked on a few sites that I know do this. One is utah.gov. You type that into a browser, and what you get back is a location saying, that resource actually lives at utah.gov/index.html. Now, not in and of itself a horrible thing. So why is this sort of thing potentially bad? Well, I ran this several times, and the average it took was 120 milliseconds for that loop. So nothing that they do on this page is ever going to recover that 120 milliseconds. Right? Even if this page took 0 time, like impossible, but 0 time, the page would still take 120 milliseconds because it's doing this redirect loop. So I really encourage people not to do this sort of thing. And then I thought, well, you know, there's actually even worse examples than this. So I went to you type desertnews.com in, and it says, oh, I know where that resource is. It's actually at www.desertnews/. And so the browser says, okay, I'll make that request. And it goes, I know what you're looking for. That's actually www.desertnews.com/home. And I ran this a whole bunch of times, and the average was 150 milliseconds for each of those loops. In some cases, it was worse. It was like 300 milliseconds for each of those loops. But on average, they're eating 300 milliseconds doing nothing but trying to get you to the right spot. So sometimes redirects are really handy. But if you can avoid it, that's a big win. Right? I mean, if they just served content right here, and didn't change anything else on their page, on average, their page would load 300 milliseconds faster, without making any other changes. So maybe I can convince them to do that someday.
You gonna put a caveat in there for the SEO guy, because he's rolling over right now, just freaking out, saying multiple duplicate content all over the place. Get us to one spot.
Shouldn't be duplicate content.
Well, deseretnews.com/ and deseretnews.com.
There's really no point in having a home, right? If you're going to
Right, no, the third, clearly, they're screwed up. But, and yes, you probably want your most common place to be the place where the content resides, but
Exactly.
you have to 301 that stuff to one spot.
But where you could do that redirect is on this last one. Yeah.
In light of the SEO, it's probably better to not do the redirect and put a canonical reference in the page itself. So that Google understands they can be identical copies, but just index the one. You get all the benefits and none of the drawbacks.
And there are other options as far as SEO sort of stuff. Google you can actually tell it if you own a domain, and I think it's Webmaster Tools. You can actually tell it.
Don't trust those tools. They
This
don't
is
work.
the canonical reference. You're trusting Google with SEO.
Yeah.
So, yeah. Other parts of this is we kind of get higher up the stack is CSS. Now, sometimes people don't like think about CSS as far as a performance standpoint, but there's a lot of things you can do in here to make stuff better. First rule, and again, super generalization, that CSS references should always be at the top. As high up as you can get it in the head, that's where you want to load your CSS. The reason for that is that browsers will block rendering of a site until they have loaded CSS. So you want that process to happen as early as possible. If you were to put it in the footer, for instance, and the browser gets the HTML and goes, there's a CSS reference at the bottom. I'm not going to render anything until I've gotten to that point and loaded it, because CSS is designed to change the way the page looks. So browsers inherently go, I don't want to do reflows. I want to have a pretty good idea of what this looks like before I start showing it to the user. So you want that process to happen as early as possible. Yeah?
I know it's bad practice already before I get into this, but does inline CSS have the same effect, or just CSS references?
Both.
Same.
Now, in some cases, you'll see, like page speed sometimes will tell you if it'll look at your CSS files and go, you have a CSS file that is like 5 lines. And it'll tell you it might be better to actually inline that CSS. The reason for that is the trade-off between making a new request for a separate file versus just processing the inline. Because there's always overhead for making another request, even with keep alive. So you've got to kind of decide where that balance is. Now you might go, well, it's 5 lines now, but I know I'm just starting, and by the end of the month it'll be 3,000 lines, so I'm not going to make that change. But that's where the testing comes in, where you go, okay, well, if I move it inline, does it actually make a difference? So there's a lot of those variables that come up. People sometimes wonder, are CSS IDs versus classes, which one's faster? Technically, IDs are faster, but it's like on the order of single-digit milliseconds. it's if you're having this discussion of whether or not I should use a class versus an ID to improve the reference for this, performance-wise, it's not even a discussion worth having. Do whatever works best for your development flow and things like that as far as versus classes versus IDs. Now that said, most of us, I assume, speak English, and so we look at this and read it as ID nav A element. We read this left to right. That's just the way we're used to reading stuff. Browsers read this. We read left to right. Browsers read right to left. That's a problem for this type of thing. Because what a browser is going to do is say, I'm going to look up every single A tag on this page. And then, I'm going to see if one of them has an ID of nav. Now, if you've got 14,000 A elements on your page, that's a fair bit of work. So we want to make this more efficient. And the general rule is just remember right to left for browsers. Now there are actually good reasons for this, because the way you've got to support rinky-dink little site with just a few elements, and then you've got to support Gmail with a massively complex page. So the reason, in a nutshell, that they do this is that they try and eliminate the biggest chunk of the page first. And that tends to be more efficient on the aggregate. So some examples of how this works. If you're trying to select every single element, that's going to be really, really bad. Now you can make that a little better and say, okay, well, I'm only A tags. And you can make it a little bit even better than that by saying, I want just the now class. And actually, depending on your markup, that might turn out to be really efficient because you might only have one instance of that class. And you're probably very likely to only have one instance of that class in that ID. So it's not perfect, but it's better. Another thing I see a lot in CSS is getting way out of control with making it super specific. This is going to be a ginormous amount of work for the browser. I don't know exactly why people write like that, but sometimes it happens. This is going to be a lot less work. It's still not great, but it's much better than the other one. So when you're writing your CSS rules, try and scope them such that they're as specific as they can be with a minimal amount of element references. Now, fortunately, there's a lot of great discussion. Browser vendors are really interested in you writing efficient CSS, so they've got some great references. I mean, if you probably just Google writing performance CSS, these things will float to the top. But yeah, Google, Mozilla, there's Microsoft. Yeah.
Where's the Microsoft ones? Won't they have?
Open source conference.
Now, fortunately,
you said a bad word.
Fortunately, most of these rules apply either way, right? If you apply the rules that they talk about, they're going to do just as well in IE as they do in Chrome. But sometimes I've kind of wondered if Google started writing Chrome just so internally they'd have a better idea of how browsers work. Like, it sounds like a kind of flimsy reason to go launch a giant project like that, but sometimes I wonder. Another thing, minify your CSS. The idea here is that we write CSS that's really great for reading as a person, but that's not the most efficient way necessarily to send it across the wire. So minify will do things like, depending on how crazy you want to get, but basic things are stripping out extra spaces, new lines, all that sort of stuff. I don't go over the top as far as like, you can have things where they will go through and rename things if they're too long, they'll use vendor prefixes or fix all the different things. I don't usually go over the top. I usually just try and get the spacing compressed. That also helps because if you minify your CSS and you turn on HTTP compression, the file across the wire will still be smaller than if you didn't minify it. Another technique is called CSS sprites. The idea here is that we have a lot of images on our pages. Each image, if it's a separate file, means a separate request to go get this. Now, a CSS sprite says, we're going to take all those images, and we're actually going to just amalgamate them all into one giant image. So we're going to make one request. We get that image back. And then in CSS, we're going to use image offsets to display just the chunk that I want. So this is really common if you have like navigation arrows and stuff like that, have different directions and all those sorts of things. You just use CSS offsets to do that. Yeah?
This practice doesn't tend to work when you're using bullets for list elements or for actual images that are syntactically meaningful. But it works great if you're using backgrounds or images that aren't terribly useful. They just improve the aesthetic.
It's also, if you want to talk about like where it's like the hugest win, is where you're referencing the same image over and over in a page. Because then it doesn't even have to worry about cache requests or stuff like that. It's all just that one file. Right. SpriteMe.org is a really great tool to help develop those sorts of things.
That might do this, but do you have to do the sprites ahead of time by hand, or can you configure the server to have 4 images and put them together and send it out?
So there are tools that will build this. So SpriteMe.org, there's other tools, but this I point this one out because it has a bookmarklet that you drag up to your browser. And then on any page, you hit the SpriteMe bookmarklet, and it'll analyze the page and go, we can make a sprite out of the following images, and it'll generate the CSS offsets for you and everything.
But it won't do it on the fly.
It will not do it on the fly.
Okay.
Technically, there's no reason why you couldn't, on the server, do that sort of thing. I don't think there's very many people that do. They probably want to make sure like stuff looks exactly perfect.
So this is usually for embellishments and things that aren't changing day to day.
Right.
Yeah, nightmare to have to maintain all the changes, images. They change a lot.
If it was changing a lot, then yeah, that might not be a good trade-off for you. So again, these are like rules that can help, but you don't have to like live and die by these sorts of things. JavaScript, right? There's hardly a page anymore that doesn't deal with JavaScript. The big general rule is exactly the opposite of CSS. JavaScript should always go at the bottom. Now again, this is actually for the same exact reason that CSS should go at the top. Because the browser goes, oh, there's JavaScript here. That might change the way the page looks. So I'm going to be careful about how I do that. Because they really want to avoid reflows. Now, the other good technique is loading these async. If you have used Google Analytics, they use this technique now. And this is kind of like the canonical way to load JavaScript asynchronous. If you're not familiar with this, we'll just break it down real quick. The idea here is that we're creating an anonymous function reference. This allows us to not mess with the global namespace in JavaScript for the page, which is basically we're playing nice. This section says we're going to create a new script element. We're going to use the HTML5 spec to set async to true, which is probably a little redundant in this case, but it's not going to hurt. And we're going to set the source reference to whatever the URL is for the JavaScript that you're loading. Next step, we say, go get the first script tag in the page, and we're going to insert our JavaScript just before that. And what that does is it forces a new script tag into the page. The browser goes, there's more JavaScript to load, and goes and loads it. But it does that after it's already gone through and done most of the page work. If you look at the network panel, you'll see DOM content loaded, which gets fired and stuff like that. So you'll be able it requires you to write your JavaScript in such a way that you're aware that this is when it's loading. But as long as you play nice by those rules, you can get an additional win as far as the browser rendering your page faster. Who uses jQuery? Got a few people. jQuery is pretty common. We're going to walk through a few ways to make your jQuery less painful. Here's a simple chunk of a page that we're going to use as a reference. And what we're going to want to do is pick out that particular paragraph. Now, there's a whole bunch of ways to do this in jQuery. Anybody want to take a stab at which one of these is the fastest? Any other guesses?
I would say the second to the last, does it read right to left?
Okay. This is what it looks like. This list is actually in order of worst to best. The reason, again, this is, left to right, so those aren't good. This is slightly better because it's saying grab this reference and then look for a child p tag. This is, again, slightly better because it's saying, this is basically the same thing. It's saying this context for p tag. It's doing a little bit more work because jQuery has to go through and do its step. You don't actually have to do that. You can skip it. These aren't the best ways to do this, though. Anybody want to take a stab at what the best one is here?
The bottom one.
See, now, I'll give you a hint. These are not in order. I was making the slides. I thought, somebody's going to catch on to this. No. The top is actually the best. The reason for that is that there's a couple of steps. It's using the existing jQuery object, and it's scoped to just that chunk of HTML, and then it's looking up the p tag. All of these are better than the previous slide. But that top one is the best. There's an existing test at a site called JSPerf.com, which basically is designed just to do these sorts of tests. And that is a full URL for this particular test. Excuse me. Now, how many of you write JavaScript without jQuery? Anybody? A couple people? All right. Anybody want to take... Well, okay. The first one is slower than the second one. Anybody want to take a guess at relative magnitude of how much faster this second one is?
Probably not much.
Not much? How many people say not much? One. How many people say a whole bunch?
Well, this sounds like a loaded question.
So I went to JSPerf, and I set up this test. And I ran it on, you can run the test in your own browser. So the numbers are, whoops.
Not anymore, you can't.
No!
There you go.
Right.
That's back.
All right. So don't worry about the specific numbers because I ran this on my laptop. It's like, oh, come on.
It's on.
That's back.
Okay.
Don't touch the table.
Don't touch the table. That's the relative difference. Now, the specific numbers aren't important because this is on a 5-year-old laptop. Yeah, the raw JavaScript was a gazillion times faster. So, jQuery is great. I love it. I use it. Don't get me wrong. But if you're strictly looking at performance, sometimes if you're doing something simple, you don't have to worry about abstracting across different browsers and stuff like that. You can do, much faster techniques. Another problem that comes up is being careful with event handlers. Last year, I think it was, maybe 2 years ago. Twitter had a real issue with, they have this infinite scroll thing on their tweets, right? And they had an event handler that basically said, every time you move the mouse, check to see if we're at the bottom, and if we are, loads more tweets. that is way, way, way more work than you need to do. So they actually came up with a technique that made that much more better as far as performance goes, where they would only look to see if you were at the bottom section of the page. Basically, it fired the event less frequently, which was good. Another thing you can do in JavaScript is minimize it as well. You've got to be really careful with this one, though, because like the Bootstrap guys, if anybody's looked at the Bootstrap framework, they have some JavaScript. And they were trying to be all funky and left off some semicolons and stuff like that. And so when it would get minified, it would break. Which is like the last thing you want your JavaScript to do, right? So you can do this. Just be careful about it. Maybe don't go crazy. All right. There's a whole bunch of other tips that we'll just fire through real quick. A lot of people... Oh. Please? What happened?
Wiggle a cable. Yeah? There we go. Nobody move.
Don't move. I'm not going to stand here and hold the cable for this anyway. And here I am. Okay. Some people like to have like a little fake CDN, but what they'll do is they'll just tack it onto their existing domain. And one of the reasons that's a bad technique is because most people will use cookies domain-wide, and so they're sending cookies for that where they just needed it that. So I usually just tell people, use just a separate domain. Now, I don't have the numbers posted on a slide, but I looked at this for DeseretNews.com just because I wanted to abuse them. They had over 1K in cookie data for each request. They had over 70 items on the elements that had to be requested on the page. So each page load had an extra not entirely, but roughly 70K that could have been dropped dramatically if they'd used a separate hostname for the static resources. So there, you can do some wins there. Optimizing images is another thing that comes up a lot. Some of you might be familiar with these specific tools like PinCrush and JPEG Trans. Smush It is actually a Yahoo property, but basically it'll take care of doing a lot of these automated things for you. Another one that just I saw recently is called Image Optum, and it combines a whole bunch of these tools and gives you a little Mac GUI interface for them. Yes?
A lot of the optimization tools that are out there that I've tried tend to tell you that you should optimize certain images, and they will take images and change the format. Like they'll say, this GIF should be a PNG, and then you get into the issues of like the alpha transparency doesn't work in Internet Explorer. What do you do about that?
So yeah, you do have to be careful. Some images you probably just shouldn't touch. But things like converting from GIF to PNG, a lot of times what will happen is you can do like reduced palette sets and stuff like that, which will allow you to reduce the size. Sometimes it's something as simple as just going, do you really need all your EXIF data in this JPEG? Probably not. So I mean, there's some things where you alter the image and it ends up being worse, so you don't want to do that. But most of these, and this is why I recommend these tools. These tools are generally pretty conservative. Like you're unlikely to get a bad result out of these. I'm sure it happens, but it's less likely. And I generally pick the conservative route as far as I'd rather it work than not. Yeah.
One of the things that I do for alpha transparency problems in Internet Explorer is I actually have two versions of every transparent image. One's a PNG, one's a GIF, and I actually serve out the GIF versions to Internet Explorer. It's a lot more work to do it that way, but it always looks good.
Right, right. So, that's an option. Sometimes you may just have to serve up different content. Thank you, Internet Explorer.
Is there only one figure of merit? Is it just the file size? Is that all?
In general, for images, it's just the file size. Okay. I mean, between formats, there's not that much difference in the browser having to render them. I mean, they're pretty good about that, and that's, it's been established for a long time. Another technique is just to delay loading certain stuff after the rest of the page is triggered. one thing that I did was for the service we have called Gravatar. If you've seen like use GitHub and you see the little images, people's images, that's all served from Gravatar. But I was looking at it, and I'm like, in some cases, you've got pages with like hundreds of comments. You're literally loading hundreds of different images, and they're not that critical to the page. I mean, they're nice, don't get me wrong. But as far as interacting with the page, it's okay if we load those afterwards. So I generated some little JavaScript that basically goes through, you generate this HTML, and it goes through and says, look for all load Gravatar classes. This is the MD5 of the email, which is what Gravatar uses to figure out which image to load. And after the rest of the page is loaded, this JavaScript fires and loads all those images. So it's, depending on the page, it can be a win. But what that allows them to do is the user can already start using the page before the rest of those images have loaded. And they may want to do something right away and don't even end up loading all those images because they've already left to go do something else.
Is that pretty typical for like if you're using Omniture, Core Metrics, or Google Analytics? Do they build that into their stuff that you put on the bottom of your page, or do we need to go back through and look at that and make sure that it's being loaded after the fact?
Usually, that's something you have to go and check, just because you don't always know what people are doing internally, and if it's a minified chunk of JavaScript, it's hard to read, you don't know what it's doing. But things like the Chrome Network panel will tell you when DOM content on load finished and stuff like that, and what events transpired after that. And it'll also even tell you what triggered it in the first place. So I usually just go and look at that. I just can't be sure without having to read everybody's code, which half the time I can't understand. Because it's all minified and yuck. Favicon. There's some really fascinating stories with Favicon. One, so it's a really common technique for a lot of CMSs to do things like, say, they'll have an htaccess file that says, if the file exists, serve it. If it doesn't, redirect every other request to index.php, whatever, right? You have some sort of front control. This is a really common pattern. And in general, it works really well. There was a certain service that was using exactly that in their code, and they didn't have a favicon on their site. So what would happen is, the browser would say, I'm looking for a favicon, and the web server would go, the file doesn't exist, so pass it to the front handler for their site, which had to reload all the database queries and had to parse through and look to see if any of their URLs matched a favicon. And they were getting crushed. They got some popular links, and they were getting crushed. And what it turned out to be is all these additional requests for favicon that they didn't need to do. So they popped a little favicon on the file and on the server, and all of a sudden the load just back down to zero.
It checks in a few places, doesn't it? So they were probably getting like 4 requests instead of 1.
Yeah.
Wow.
It's really screwy. And it was a 404, so it wasn't being cached. So the next time they come to the site, it goes through the same thing again. So sometimes it's the little things, like a favicon is like nothing, right? Sometimes it's the little things that can make a gargantuan difference. Another thing that comes up, a lot of Ajax on sites, just make sure that you're applying basically all the same rules that you would apply to other requests. If it's something that can be cached, are you caching it? Are you sending the right headers? Are you doing all that stuff? Are you compressing the responses properly? Sometimes if this is handled by PHP or Python or Ruby or whatever, you're not compressing the results, so you're sending back more data size across the wire than you really need to. Basically, you just go through the same exact sort of rules. If you really want to get into micro optimization, Yahoo posted their 16 rules or whatever years ago, and one of them was use HTTP GET instead of POST if if it doesn't need to alter data. And I read that and I thought, okay, but that seems like kind of like a business. Why would you do that? So I did some study on that. This is one of those things like I couldn't let go. Why would you do that? And it turns out, now I haven't updated this, but a couple years ago, I fired up Wireshark and downloaded every browser I could think of, and ran AJAX GET requests and AJAX POST requests. And it turns out that browsers use multiple TCP packets per post, even if the entire content of it can fit in one packet. Okay. So it turns out and that wasn't 100% true, but basically 99% of the case. And it gets, we can talk about that. That story gets weirder later, but that's like a micro optimization that you probably don't care about, but sometimes people get really stuck on. Other things to do is experiment with a service called Gazillion. Steve Souders built this site, and what it does is allow you to drag and drop different aspects. Like you can say, give me an asynchronous JavaScript at the bottom, and give me CSS at the top, and do all these things, and then save it, and then it'll run it in your browser, and it'll give you little timing results and stuff like that. So you can kind of play with different page techniques, and then see how they would actually work in your browser. And you can save that URL and send it to whoever, so you can see different tests. It's just a convenient way to just sort of experiment with some of these techniques and see what actually happens. Another site is called BrowserScope. This is a site who's kind of just designed to run different sets of tests across different sets of browsers and see how they're all interacting. Sometimes you run into optimizations where you're like, this is a huge win, but when I look at browser usage on my site, that only makes up like 10% of my users, so maybe that optimization isn't that big of a deal. BrowserScope allows you to run and see a whole series of different tests across a whole series of different browsers, gives you a better idea of what's going on as far as real-world usage. So, just a few more minutes, and I think I'm pretty much done. So if you have other questions or something you want to dive deeper in, we can do that in a few minutes, and also be around later. So, yes?
A lot of the things that you've talked about, I have read, are available if you're familiar with the HTML5 boilerplate project. It also has the build process in it, which uses AND, which automates the minifying and the concatenation and the PNG crush. Have you used that? How effective is that as opposed to individual projects or processes? It's something that I want to do. I don't have on any of my projects now, but I'd really like to automate that. I've never thought about having a build process for a website.
So there are a lot of, the nice part is there's a lot of excitement in this area. So there are a lot of tools being developed as far as, deploying and, on deploy, you alter these things to optimize whatever. A lot of the newer template services and things like that will have these sort of best practices built in. The reason I usually still bring this up to developers is because a lot of times they'll take those tools and start, and then as they continue to develop, if they're not kind of thinking about these sorts of things, you can end up with ways where those tools can't compensate for some of the techniques. Like oftentimes their general rules are, don't break it. So if I can't optimize it in a way that doesn't break it, then I won't optimize it. So you still have to kind of be aware of these sorts of things. Now the other thing is there's lots of services. There's even plugins like, what's the Google one? Is it ModPHP? There's an Apache module. ModPHP, yeah. That Google has done, where basically they will rewrite chunks of your page to apply some of these rules automatically. I personally haven't used that a lot, but it's something that you could explore as an option. But again, it's one of those things where if it runs into a situation where you have designed your site or code in such a way that it can't optimize it correctly, it won't. Because again, the fear is we'd rather have it work and be slower than to be broken and fast.
Okay.
Any other questions? Yeah.
Do you have an opinion on separating out or combining JavaScript files or CSS files so that you have fewer requests versus separating them out so you may have more requests, but the page only gets the JavaScript that it needs?
So the question is about separating various JavaScript files versus combining them into one. A lot of that is kind of developer driven, in my personal 2 cents. Because if your flow is such that you can get away with having like one giant JavaScript file versus having several others, that tends to be better because you're making fewer requests. That said, if the management overhead of doing that becomes such a giant mess, then maybe it's not for that particular case. There are some other, again, there's a lot of excitement in this area. There are people developing tools to manage that type of stuff. So let's say, well, you can develop it and keep it separate, and then on the fly, we'll do a combination, and then you only have to do one. Now, the other thing that gets tricky is it's really hard sometimes to test these across the site. It's usually easier to do a measurement on a given page, but you might have JavaScript that only needs to load for this page and that page, and if you've got it all in one file, then you're going to be loading that either way, even if you don't need it. Now, maybe that's worth it. That's a trade-off you kind of have to measure and decide. Google has done some research in this area where they will do chunked loading, because the other problem is if you've got a chunk of JavaScript that only loads on this, is needed on this page, but then you update it, that updates your giant ball, which means every page, so it kind of snowballs into weird things. You need to decide in your own flow, what's the trade-off? And is that a trade-off that I'm okay with? And you need to look at your own site and say, how many are return visitors, so they're getting cache results, how many are new visitors, so they're not. There's a whole bunch of variables that come into it.
Towards the beginning of your talk, you mentioned the Chrome page speed plugin, and you said it's from the same guys that made YSlow?
So there's a history there. Steve Souders works at Google, and he helps the page speed folks. He started at Yahoo when he was doing all this research, and they created a plugin called YSlow. It's kind of the same sort of thing, but at this point, page speed's kind of more the de facto than YSlow.
I've used YSlow.
YSlow, it's the same idea, but page speed's kind of become the de facto now and run away with that area.
YSlow was good, but it was...
Yeah, it doesn't get as much attention as it used to.
It was like trying to argue with WeFit. Never going to make it happen.
All right, anything else? I think we're done then. Thank you.
Where was that? What? Where was that? You didn't invite me.
Sure.
You should have invited me. Yeah, I know. Right. This one and the last one. Yeah, but if he did some of these things,
Have you gotten the season stuff and everything? He's got finder for the ball.
So it's mostly a perceived as if you do what you can do is convince the browser to load after
why do you think I rewrite most of it?
And so that allows people to interact with the page. Whether or not you really want that question to happen kind of depends on because if it's heavy JavaScript, maybe you don't want to bother with that. You want to get that little bit of edge system locked out when you get in there because that's how that interacts. hey,
I have 6,
it's
then
mostly just
there's rare occasions where you
enhancing the
don't want to do before the dog
and maybe it's okay to say, oh, because it allows us rather to render faster. I don't even know if
we're done in the keynote level.
That's why I
It's
kind
lunch,
of
and it looks like
that's going to change depending on what you thought it was going to be. And so that's where I'm if it depends.
No, it's it's 2, well, it's 2, yeah. It's the keynote, is it? They got 2 speakers. But the first
second speaker on.
Yeah, he's going to get up there and say, "Is this the great thing? Here comes your next comedian up is now." And he's going to get off stage and the keynote's actually
right. So in that case, there's a lot of
I mean, I don't think he's going to talk about stop it. Oh, it's G-rate isn't these things great. The virtualization rate. You guys can have to do the is the cloud the open source world is the cloud.
And so they run into that as like, how do we update this giant JavaScript?
You're going to stay here and eat lunch, you're going to go off. Is there
I don't know. I don't know if there is or not.
free lunch?
I don't know. I think that might have been lunched at the Blue House.
I didn't think it was that allows them still funky. We did
It's a good idea. We have a good describes everything that we know well. So I think the first thing we do is to slow the process down. But that said, there's a lot of interesting techniques in this stuff. I don't regret doing it.
I think you guys are critical things. Most people need to go through that process, figure out what's important for them. And I tried to bring up a few signs. These are the rules.
Yeah.
But you also need to know when they're ready. Yeah. Don't live, breathe, and die. Sure, for some things, unfortunately, I get to see that, right? I get to work on a site where it's like, oh, we get.
I only worked in that lab for 4 months.
So sometimes, yeah, you end up doing different things, and it's, kind of general if you don't have to do it.
Right.
Maybe don't worry about it. That's always you can always go back and improve it later.
We'd be 100%, the right way that we should be doing this, but that's not necessary. At least at this point.
I have a question for you.
Sure.
I've heard a lot of discussion about the JavaScript at the bottom and the CSS at the top. I was also reading, I thought, of course, thought of this after you said one more question. We're done. A lot of the newer browsers, don't they do, I know there's JavaScript blocks when it tries to load. Doesn't a lot of the newer browsers do up to 6 requests or multiple requests for files? So if you have a bunch of the header, it won't block on the first one, wait till that fully loads, and block on the second one, wait, it'll grab 6.
Some do better than others.
Honestly, some do better than others. So.
There's a mixed issue there because you get into a combination of things like you have to keep alive, so you want to reuse connections. But if you have separate host names, you want to break those out.
Yeah.
But you've got to figure out where that line is. Usually for most it's like 4. Like if you're doing more than 4 host names, you're having to initiate new connections for all of these is probably killing the benefit of spreading them out. So you end up with, just bizarre things. And that might change over time. Yeah. Right. For now, my understanding is that, what I've seen is 4 is kind of but that could change.
I'll have to try it out. Thank you.
Yeah, that's the thing. Try it out. Find out what works best.
So, thank you.
Yeah.
Even though I may work with the company that does the budget reviews, I don't work on this stuff.
Thanks for your presentation. I'm sure Justin will be happy to walk in. Thanks.
I'm going to give Justin a ton of grief when he starts, but just because it's ding-dong thing sometimes. Like the redirects, I'm just like, just serve the content.
Yeah, but I wonder when SEO started paying attention to route canonical, because I think it's only been in about the past year and a half that's made a big swell in SEO circles.
And the canonical stuff is, well, first of all, they named it backwards, but I don't know. You know,
because it used to
SEO
really
is
matter.
Yeah, SEO is basically impossible to measure. And so making minute tweaks like that are even harder to measure. And so it's, well, yes, basically, what I tell people is go follow the Google guidelines.
Yeah.
And write good stuff.
Yeah.
And share it.
But, I mean, because I was thinking the other day, because Justin had said, hey, I think I know what's going on with the Desert News. You must have pinged him on this or something.
We had a long Skype chat.
Yeah. He's like, I think it's because of the redirects. I'm like, well, I'm sure that's, causing some of it, but that's not going to be the majority of any slowdown there. There's so much else going on there.
Well, the reason I bring it up, like Desert News, because they're doing it twice, is that unless you get rid of this, nothing else you do on the page is going to recover that time.
Right, I think it's a great point.
And it's a third of a second. Right? So, I mean, if the rest of your page takes half a second, I mean...
No, I think it's great stuff, so hopefully you can take that and send it in an anonymous email to support it.
I've tried a few times to get some of these places to do it, and usually I get an initial like, oh, thanks for your input, and then
if you don't know,
and then I'm like, so you're gonna do something to improve this? Oh,
yeah. I mean, look at KSL.com, right? So another one, we do their site as well, and they get a lot of traffic, right? I mean, because of their classifieds, they're considered the #4 news website in the country, right? They're just behind CNN. And, I mean, so I think a slow day is around, 1.5, almost 2 million page views a day.
Good country.
Right. I mean, there are a lot of sites that do a lot more traffic, because news is not the most traffic stuff, but they have URLs that are like NID equals 75 and SID equal, right?
So I had a meeting with folks at, I guess this was right after DDM did their split. And because they were asking about WordPress stuff, and I'm going to be talking about WordPress stuff. Kill me because I can't remember the guy's names, but it's been a few years. Because I looked at some of their stuff and I asked them, what is this? And like, we had a guy who built all of this, and it was all XML powered.
Yeah.
And all those NIDs and stuff like that, those are all XML references, and I'm like, oh my goodness. Oh, so bad. So, do the simple, obvious things. I mean, in general, too, I tell people, like, I'm not a huge, SEO sort of guy. I tell them, make it so that it's pleasant for your users.
Right.
And the rest, Google will take care of itself. I get irritated when people are like, let's optimize it for Google. So you're writing a website to optimize it for a machine reading it. If your audience is machines, great, go for it.
And in a lot of SEO circles, what I tend to hear, because I'm on a committee that is obsessed with SEOs, right? I'm not particularly, but I'm starting to hear more of, if you've got good content, you will rank higher. The higher quality